Mechanics of Reddit. What's the dumbest thing you've seen someone do to their vehicle? Please subscribe, leave a like, comment and share the video to help the channel. My old mechanic had a guy come in with a Ford probe. He claimed it was low on oil. They take the dipstick out and the whole stick has oil on it. He checks again with the same result. The guy took the oil cap off and looked down into the hole and said, "See, it is low." He had put 3 to 4 cases of oil in the motor trying to fill the entire block up. The previous mechanic didn't know how to patch an exhaust leak and had tried to weld a Rockstar can around the leak. The leak caused the second oxygen bank to fail, which is why they tried to patch it with a can. Not a week later the bank read a failure again. This probably won't be the worst one in this thread. I used to know a 30-year-old who would put the car air freshener duct taped outside the exhaust, kind of just dangling in front of the opening. His logic was it makes the exhaust smell better for pedestrians. Had a customer once who had their oil light come on and couldn't figure out how to top the oil up. He thought it might have worked like his boat motor, so he poured a jug of oil in his fuel tank. Not a mechanic, but former service writer. Woman comes in for an oil change. Some common minivan, nothing out of the ordinary. Walked by the van while it was up on the rack and noticed one of the tires was nearly bald in the middle. Cords showing. Textbook overinflation. I checked the tire pressure, was well overinflated. Then looked around the vehicle, 2 more tires were in exactly the same state, overinflated and showing damage from it. The 4th was a bit underinflated, no glaringly obvious tread wear. Pointed it out to the customer when she came back, asked if there's any reason 3 tires would be overinflated. Long story short, she was occasionally seeing a low tire light on the dash, no indication of which tire, just low tire, told her husband, and he just aired up all 4 tires. Happened again. Fixed the same way, rinse and repeat. So over time they kept the tire with the leak going, but managed to ruin the other 3. Buy a tire pressure gauge if your car doesn't give you per tire pressure readings. I was working at a performance shop at the time, 2010. Golf GTI comes in for lack of power and throwing check engine codes for underboost and several for fuel trim management conditions. Did the typical process of checking the turbo wastegate operation. Pressure and smoke, tested the charge side of the turbo system for leaks, tested fuel pressures, all checked out. Removed the intake side from the turbo to inspect for rips in the rubber boot, all good. Looked inside the intake boot and this moron bought one of these turbinator gimmicky things and put it inside the intake. It had turned completely on its side and was restricting 80% of the airflow. Removed the obstruction and motor operating values returned to normal and power was restored. Did not feel any guilt that this idiot had to pay a few hundred for me to diagnose and remove his awesome DIY performance mod. I wrench on bikes, not cars, and at least once a month we have someone come in that put chain lube or grease on their brake rotors because they were squealing and now wants to know why their brakes aren't grabbing. Completely fill their engine with oil and wonder why it's smoking, and then locked up. The list is long. Removing PCV hose, assorted vacuum lines, O2 sensor, etc. thinking they are going to get better performance. Cutting a wire under the dash to hook up a stereo. Then bringing the car to me to fix the tail lights. Pouring 3 quarts of oil in, but the dipstick still shows low because they put the oil in the radiator. Putting gasoline in a diesel truck, again. I bought my car off a guy for $785. For all intents and purposes it worked fine, but the guy said that it overheated almost daily. 1999 Nissan Sentra, manual, 135k miles. If it didn't overheat it would have been closer to $3-4k, maybe even more. I bought it anyways, cause I could try fixing it, and cause I was desperate for a car. My old one died, and I live 10 miles from work. So I brought the car home. The guy filled the radiator per an agreement we made, and the overflow tank was already empty. I started feeling along the coolant piping, and when I came to the thermostat sensor housing I could stick my fingernail inside the gap. My fingers came out soaking wet with coolant. Went to a parts store, spent $10 on a housing gasket, $3 on some liquid gasket, and $50 on new oil, a new oil filter, a new air filter, radiator cleaner, and coolant. Spent an entire day putting that gasket in. The reason it took so long is a freaking story and a half that was all about Murphy's Law. Changed the oil, cleaned out the radiator, and I haven't had any trouble since. All in all, a perfectly working car for about $850. I kinda feel bad for the dude who sold it to me. Edit. So if you're satisfied with the story, stop here. The Murphy's Law story. The housing is underneath two solid pipes that are part of the ACK system, which means that on top I have about 2 inches of space to work with, and underneath is so curved that only my skinny ass wrists will fit, no tools. There are 3 bolts, 1 on top, 2 on bottom, and my socket wrench could only move 1 click at a time with some fighting. Getting the bolts out took 10 to 15 minutes each. I put the housing gasket in, closed it, and tested it. Still leaking. So I unbolted it back up, applied liquid gasket to either side of the physical foam gasket, and finger tightened it. Then you have to wait an hour for the liquid gasket to dry before tightening it all the way. After the hour, I went to tighten the bolts. Got one. Got the second. I turned the third 4 times and snap. It seared right through the threading inside the housing. So I had to unbolt it back up, scrape off the now ruined gasket. Luckily it came in a pack of 2, and get the bolt out. The bolt was sticking out 1 thread. I grabbed a set of needle nose pliers, the only thing that would fit, and began the painstakingly slow process of turning the bolt with the pliers, 2 inches of space at a time. It took half an hour. Luckily my old, now dead car used the same bolts, so I snagged one off of it. While I was at it, and already pretty frustrated, I went and rummaged around for another half hour before finding a bolt screwdriver that was the exact right size to fit under the piping and at least mostly tighten the bolts. Putting the entire setup together the third time took 20 minutes plus waiting time for the liquid gasket to dry. Did a co-op at a shop back in high school. Guy complains about how his car doesn't sit straight. We pull it in and don't even need to put it on the lift to realize that he has 17-inch rims on one side and 15s on the other. Took me about 45 minutes of explaining to him why cars aren't made like that before he told us that he'd be taking his business elsewhere. On a side note, the side with the 15s were 100% bald, like racing slick bald, and everything in that car was falling to pieces. I have too many stories of shit I found in people's cars there, but this one has to be my favorite. Worked as a car cleaner at a dealership one summer in high school. Guy towed in a relatively new, top of the line Corvette he had bought there some time before I started. He was pissed that it had died on the road and been running like shit before that. Ranting and raving about he spent all this money and it only went X months/years before completely breaking down. One of my work buddies got it up on a lift and started looking it over. He opens the oil drain plug and nothing comes out. He pulls apart the engine and the oil could now be best described as glue. Owner talks to the guy and asks when the last time he changed the oil was. Guy had zero idea what he was talking about. He had no idea that you had to do that. He assumed you just added gas and that's the only thing you needed to do. The engine was a complete loss, which meant the car was a complete loss to him. I had a guy bring his motor swapped late 80s F150 in for some transmission work. These came factory with either a 300 straight 6, 351 V8, or 460 V8. He put 2.3L carbureted 4-cylinder out of an old Ranger in it. The reasoning behind the swap was that it'd improve fuel mileage at the cost of some speed. The thing could barely move under its own power. If you floored it, it would top out at about 55 miles per hour, wide open, and take a good minute or 2 to get there. Had a guy show up at a tire shop bragging about being blackout drunk and needed his tire changed. He had his spare on with 3/5 lug nuts. He had tightened them by hand and they backed off. Had to replace all the studs. Folks would come in asking for tire repairs, patches, on tires that were literally cut in half. Like you drove on the rim for a week split down the middle in half. They'd get so offended when I explained they not only needed a tire, but now a rim as well. I've seen a fake intercooler on a Sunfire, paper mache used instead of Bondo. The list goes on. Not a car mechanic, but I knew a guy who used self-tapping screws to fasten a roof rack to his car. Edit. A few people have asked if it worked. Yes, but it leaked. I would not recommend it though, because the roof sheet metal probably doesn't have much load bearing integrity. Not a mechanic, but a car enthusiast. Saw a couple of cars where owners didn't know what basic maintenance was. Like no oil change, no brake pad change. The oil turned into jelly and you had to scrape it out. The most ridiculous thing were the brakes. My mechanic friend showed me the brakes of an elderly lady's car. The brake discs were gone, like almost completely wiped down to like 5 to 6 millimeters. She said to him, the car feels weird while I brake. Let me tell you about Diamond Plate Guy and Focus Bro. Diamond Plate Guy had two things he used to modify his truck, a drill and a ton of diamond plate. It was an absolute base model V6 Ram 1500 with the exhaust chopped off, which I thought was bad enough until I opened the hood. He had drilled or glued diamond plate to every flat surface, air filter box, intake manifold, fan shroud, etc. This was 18 months ago. My eyes still haven't recovered, but this isn't the end. He had some crappy wheels that he had painted white himself. I know this because he painted the inside of the wheel where it seats to the hub, which caused them to seize to said hubs. I literally had to buy a bigger hammer to smack them off. Focus Bro Guy had a custom straight pipe, full Sparco race seats, 5-point racing harnesses, lowering springs, and a base model automatic Ford Focus SE. Please subscribe, leave a like, comment and share the video to help the channel.